Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time again for our American friend TJ, who's seeking her Canadian citizenship, to ask us a question. TJ?
Hi, Dale. Yes, I am back to bother you, and today with some more on the surface esoteric but deeply interesting to me content, which is the procedural kerfuffle that I have perceived in the PEI elections. I am very curious and very confused about what's actually happening there.
Okay. Well, considering that you're used to a two-party system, having a third in the mix is probably a little bit alarming for you. So the thing with an election that doesn't result in a majority government is that the procedures can be a little more complicated and take a little more time to figure out. And one of the things that we saw on the election night was that media outlets were declaring that a conservative minority had been elected when we don't actually know that is going to be the case. The thing with a hung parliament, as we call them, where there is no clear majority winner, is that different configurations can take hold. We saw in BC last year where the BC Liberals, who are not related to the federal Liberals, won what was essentially a minority there, but decided to test the confidence of the chamber regardless, even though they didn't have the votes that they necessarily would have needed. They had a speech from the throne, they had a vote, the government fell, and then the lieutenant governor invited the NDP to form a government instead, and they came to a confidence and supply agreement with the Green Party there. A confidence and supply agreement is kind of an unofficial coalition. So instead of them having any formal sharing of powers or cabinet seats or anything to that effect, it's basically saying, we will support you for X number of period, and they worked out some things that they wanted to do in common in order to ensure that that cooperation would continue. And that isn't necessarily working out well for all of the parties, particularly given that the Greens are completely unhappy with some of the things the NDP are going ahead with in terms of certain projects with environmental concerns. So it's kind of do it at your peril. The Greens could pull their support at any time, but they have not to date, so we'll see what happens. How this applies in PEI is the seat count is far less close than it was in either BC or the New Brunswick election, which was also fairly recent, which also resulted in a hung parliament, in which the Conservatives in that province came to an agreement with the another third party, which they call the People's Alliance. And we'll get to this kind of third party notion in a minute. But so in PEI, if the provincial Greens managed to form an agreement with the provincial Liberals, they would have more seats than the provincial Conservatives. And there could be some kind of a coalition happen there if that was what they wanted to choose. So it's why it's making a call as to whether or not there's going to be a minority government and who's going to form it right at the moment is kind of a fraught game because we don't actually know. We don't know who the lieutenant governor is going to invite to form a government once the premier resigned, which he didn't for about 3 days afterward, or signaled his intention to resign because he doesn't actually resign until the moment that the transfer of power happens, because Her Majesty always needs an advisor, because that's the way our system works.
Okay, so that actually strangely helped. And a lot of my sort of the residual confusion I have is with what, as you mentioned, the media were actually saying, because a lot of the communication that came out felt very official, like X party has Y number of seats. This is what's happened. And that I find to be both confusing and alarming, considering that we're talking about the outcome of an election. And as you've just sort of contextualized for me, it seems a bit more fluid than is being presented in the media.
Well, that's right. Our system allows for a certain degree of fluidity, but media doesn't always get that notion, in part because we tend to think of politics in fairly American terms, and that kind of infects the way in which we talk about things, and map American terminology onto Canadian concepts, which doesn't actually work, which is partially why I do what I do, in order to try and let you guys know how it's actually working and not just trying to map some American terminology onto a Westminster Parliament.
Okay, and that is a noble goal indeed, seeking clarification from this. And, so the last thing I am still trying to wrap my head around is the role of the third parties. And I understand at the federal level, you and I have discussed before, the role of the third party and the forming the sort of coalitions and such. It seems to be operating slightly differently at the provincial level, which I found a bit odd.
We're seeing a particular phenomenon in Canada right now where on a provincial level, third parties are getting a lot more traction, particularly in the smaller provinces where they have much smaller assemblies. There's any number of reasons why this could be the case. A lot of it seems to stem from a certain amount of fatigue in terms of, they're tired of the two main parties, whichever they may happen to be in those provinces, because it's not necessarily liberal and conservative. And to that effect, there's been this uptick in third parties winning seats where they normally wouldn't have in the past. And so that's creating a lot more of these minority situations. Either we haven't had any formal coalitions in Canada. It's always been some kind of a confidence agreement. So it's kind of an uncertain time right now. We'll see if this has any traction carrying over federally, but that's not necessarily going to be the case. Our traditional federal third party, the NDP, seems to be losing support at a rapid pace right now, if the polls are to be believed. So that could end up creating a much more polarized liberal-conservative dynamic federally. We don't really know yet. So it's going to be a question of trying to see where this trend is going, or if it's just isolating itself to provincial legislatures, or certain provinces by which things I've shaken out, particularly smaller ones. We don't really know yet, but it's certainly been an interesting phenomenon that's come to light in the last 2 or 3 years.
Well, I find that strangely soothing, because it helps me that some of the reason why I don't understand at an intuitive level what is happening in these provincial elections is because it is, as you said, a emerging phenomenon and pattern. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of your analysis on it as this stuff shakes out especially in the lead up to the Canadian election.
Looking forward to it.
All right, thanks.
And that's all for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone.